I made a huge mistake during my bachelor party trip, my fiancée moved on, and I just want her back. Part 3, we finally met. We started by texting a bit, but it felt so impersonal that the conversation stayed at a surface level. The deepest we really got was talking about Paul and me briefly divulging what Cambodian prison was like. Over the 3 weeks between our first text exchange and our meetup, we only texted maybe 5 times, and each time it started to get into heavy subjects, one of us would end the conversation. During that time, though, I did spend more time with Paul. My mother began watching him at her house again, and that gave us time to bond. I even had some one-on-one time with him when we went to get ice cream together one day. It's amazing how resilient kids are, he just goes with the flow of everything. He still calls me Rhino, but maybe I'll get the dad title soon. One day this past week, when Kevin came by to pick up Paul, he asked to talk again. This time he had a job offer for me, which had me getting pissed. Then he elaborated that it wasn't really an offer but more of a lead. His brother owns a construction company and is looking for an estimator. Kevin told his brother I was once an architect, and his brother said he'd give me an interview if I was interested. He left his brother's card with me. I really want to hate Kevin, but he does actually seem to be a genuinely nice person, which also pisses me off. His self-deprecating sense of humor grows on you fast, and this is just in 5 to 10 minute interactions with him. But at the same time, screw that guy. I talked to Emily via text this past Friday. We agreed to meet the next day for lunch. I suggested this Italian place that had been our place, but she got a little upset about this, and I thought she was going to cancel. Instead, we pivoted to Applebee's. Seeing her in person is something I can't even describe. She was just as beautiful as ever. The hello hug caused a shiver through my spine. I didn't want to let go, and I may have lingered for just a second, but I also didn't want to make it weird. We exchanged pleasantries and small talk through the ordering, and at that point the conversation took the first serious turn since my return, and it stayed that way for the next hour as we talked. She told me how hard it was to deal with my death. She was pregnant and grieving, and a lot of days she didn't want to carry on. It hurt so bad to listen to what she was going through. She told me she felt so alone anytime she was in our apartment that she spent most nights staying at her parents' or mine. She kept hoping that every time the phone rang, it would be someone with news about me, and then began to hope it wasn't, because as time went on, it became more likely that it would be a call that they found my body. She told me about how great my parents and, to a lesser degree, my siblings had been to her. My sister and I even had slightly overlapping pregnancies, so it was fun to have someone to talk to about it. It was after Paul's first birthday that my parents, of all people, talked to her about getting back out there. She admitted she was really only spending time with her parents, or my SIL, and, by extension, my brother. She said she even fell asleep while hanging out with her best friend. Emily told me it was fear. She never wanted to be away from Paul. If I could disappear in an instant, then that means anyone could. She wouldn't be able to live without him. After this intervention, she realized she was living like a widow and not a 25-year-old woman. She began hanging out with her friends again, letting others watch Paul occasionally so she could go out. It was 2 months into her attempts at living life that she ran into Kevin. They were in a Starbucks, and she was fumbling to get her phone out while holding Paul. When suddenly this tall, handsome fucker, my words, comes up and scans his phone, he buys her coffee and muffins. They strike up a conversation while waiting. When her order gets called, he grabs it and hands it to her along with a business card with his cell number on it. Kevin owns a screen printing shop. He tells her, "No pressure, but I'd like to get to know you better." Then they parted ways. She called him the next day. 4 months later, she introduced Paul to him. A year later, they moved in with him, and a few months ago, they got engaged. This is where I said my piece. I told her I still loved her and that it's impossible to see her with someone else. The idea of getting back to her was one of the few things that kept me going when I was locked away. She began to cry, and I reached out and took her hand. I asked if she was sure or if there was any way we could try again. In hindsight, I feel like this was a dumb move, but at the time, I needed to know. She shook her head. She looked up at me and said, "I love you. I never stopped, but I love Kevin too, and I'm marrying him. It's not fair, I know it's not fair, you didn't do anything wrong, but I had to move on. I spent years thinking you had died. When you came back, I was so happy, but also so guilty." I cut her off there. "You have nothing to feel guilty about. I fucked up and cost myself everything. I always knew you'd likely moved on, and I don't fault you for that. I was gone, there was no reason for you to believe I was coming back, but I did dream that I'd find my way back and you'd be there when I returned. I realized that was unrealistic. I'm sorry for putting you in this position now." She said, "It's okay, I knew this was coming eventually. We just kind of stopped talking at that point. We were just there, drinking our drinks." After a few minutes that seemed like eternity, she said, "How do you want to move forward when it comes to Paul?" I told her, "I love him already and want to be in his life." She replied, "I'm so happy for that. I always told him about you. I didn't want him to think he was abandoned." I said, "He is the one bright spot in this whole situation." From there, she told me that Kevin had planned to adopt him once they were married but wouldn't now that I had returned. I am listed on the birth certificate as the father, although I think I'll meet with a lawyer just to make sure everything is in place from a legal standpoint. We made some plans to meet together later in the week with Paul. Let him have fun with all of his parents at the same time. She also encouraged me to do more one-on-ones with him. At the end, we hugged one more time and parted ways. When I got back to my parents' house and in my room, I broke down. The finality of it all was just too much. After I recovered, I decided I was not going to wallow in my grief anymore. I needed to swallow some pride and get on track to do something with myself. The next day, I called Kevin's brother and did an interview that day. He hired me. This is the first step towards moving on.